I don't cry at funerals anymore. When my father, Thomas, was buried, the town of Harmony Creek, Montana, saw a stoic old woman. They didn't see the girl he sacrificed. My story begins not with a death, but with a lie that lived and breathed for 50 years. Our family, the Blackwoods, were royalty in this small town. My grandfather, Richard Blackwood, was the king, a philanthropist with hands that built libraries and a smile that hid rot. Our mansion was his castle, and I, Amelia, was his favorite little bird in a gilded cage. He told everyone that, but cages aren't for protecting birds, they're for owning them. I was 14 when I learned the difference. The town itself was part of the cage. Harmony Creek sat nestled in a valley, cradled by mountains that looked like sleeping giants. In the summer, the air smelled of pine and wild lupine. In the winter, the silence was so profound you could hear the snow falling. It was a beautiful prison. The Blackwood name was etched into the cornerstone of the town hall, the brass plaque on the library, the stained glass window of the church. We weren't just residents. We were the town's mythology. Richard Blackwood was the benevolent god of that mythology. People spoke of him in hushed, reverent tones. They remembered the jobs his timber mill had created, the wing he funded at the local clinic, the scholarships he provided for children who would otherwise never leave the valley. His public face was carved from aged oak and benevolence, weathered by a lifetime of supposed charity. But inside the sprawling mansion on the hill, the air was different. It was thick with unspoken rules and heavy with the scent of lemon polish and decay. The house was a labyrinth of long, shadowed hallways, rooms filled with furniture shrouded in white cloths like sleeping ghosts, and portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow you. My world was this house, and my grandfather was its architect. He curated my life like one of his prized gardens, every element placed for his viewing pleasure. I had tutors for every subject, my clothes were chosen for me, and my schedule was a rigid document that left no room for the chaotic, messy business of being a child. He called it providing the best. I now know he was forging the bars of my cage, polishing them until they shone so brightly I mistook them for sunlight. My earliest memories are of him, his large, warm hand enveloping mine, his voice a low, soothing rumble as he pointed out constellations from the grand observatory he'd had built on the east wing. He would tell me the stories of Andromeda, chained to a rock as a sacrifice. I used to think it was just a story. It took me years to realize he wasn't telling me a myth. He was telling me my future. The town saw a doting grandfather and his cherished granddaughter. They didn't see the way his grip would tighten just a little too much when I tried to pull away, the flicker of something possessive in his eyes when another man, a teacher, a mailman, anyone, spoke to me. They didn't see that I wasn't being cherished. I was being claimed. The abuse started in the one place I felt safe, the family library. Grandfather Richard would dismiss the tutors and say it was time for special lessons. He'd lock the heavy oak doors, the click of the bolt echoing the trap snapping shut. The library was my sanctuary, 2 stories of floor-to-ceiling books with a rolling ladder and the intoxicating smell of old paper and leather. It was the only place in the house where I felt I could travel, escaping into worlds of high adventure and sweeping romance. He poisoned it. He made it his domain. He called me his special little lamb, and he was the shepherd guiding me. His guidance felt like spiders crawling under my skin. The lessons were never about history or literature. They were about me. They were about him. He would sit me on the plush leather sofa before the unlit fireplace and speak of power, of legacy, of the Blackwood bloodline. He'd talk about how special I was, how different from the common people in the town below. His words were a slow-acting venom, isolating me, making me feel chosen and therefore complicit. His hands, which the mayor would shake with reverence, would trace the lines on my palm and tell me my future was intertwined with his. He'd say, "See this line, Amelia. This is your lifeline. It runs parallel to mine. We are 2 parts of the same whole." He would brush a stray hair from my face, his fingers lingering on my cheek, and the gesture, which might have looked tender to an outsider, felt like the brand of ownership. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. His power was in his stillness, in the unnerving calm with which he dismantled my world. My mother, Eleanor, was a ghost in her own home, medicated into a porcelain smile, always resting from a migraine. She floated through the cavernous rooms in silk robes, her eyes vacant, her movements slow and languid. I remember trying to talk to her once, finding her in the sunroom, staring at the dust motes dancing in the light. I told her I was having nightmares. She smiled, a beautiful, empty expression, and patted my hand. "We all have our burdens, dear," she whispered, her voice thin as parchment. "Richard has given us such a lovely life. We must be grateful." Gratitude was the anesthetic they used to numb the entire family. My father, Thomas, was a shadow, perpetually busy with estate matters, his eyes always focused on a point just over my shoulder, never meeting mine. He was a tall, handsome man, but he seemed to be shrinking, stooping under the weight of his own father's presence. He occupied the office at the far end of the hall, a room that always smelled of stale cigar smoke and fear. He managed the ledgers, the investments, the public face of the Blackwood Empire, while Richard managed the souls within it. Thomas was the steward of the cage, ensuring the bars were strong and the lock was secure. He saw everything and did nothing. His silence was a constant, deafening roar in the house. The grooming was masterful. My grandfather twisted my fear into a shared sacred secret, isolating me until his world was the only one that existed. He'd tell me, "This is our secret, little lamb, a special bond that no one else could possibly understand. To speak of it would be to profane it." He made me a guardian of my own violation. He turned the library from a sanctuary into a stage for his quiet horrors, the rows of silent, watching books the only witnesses. He was teaching me that knowledge was his to give, and my body was his to take. The town continued to worship him, my mother continued to drift, and my father continued to look away. I was utterly, completely alone, a solitary bird in a beautiful soundproof cage, and my song was dying in my throat. One evening, after a lesson that left bruises on my soul, I found the courage born of pure terror. He had been reading from an old, leather-bound book, something about feudal lords and their rights. The subtext was suffocating. His hand was on my knee, his thumb drawing slow, deliberate circles that made my skin crawl. When I finally escaped, I ran, not to my room, but down the hall, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I went to my father's study. The room smelled of leather and his cowardice. A single lamp cast a pool of amber light on his desk, leaving the rest of the room in shadow. He was poring over a ledger, his fountain pen scratching against the paper. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the silence. I stood in the doorway for a full minute, gathering the shattered pieces of my voice. "Father," I started, my voice trembling. "Grandfather. He scares me. The way he looks at me." Thomas didn't look up from his papers. His hand didn't even pause. "Your grandfather built this town, Amelia. He adores you. Don't be dramatic." The dismissal was a slap, cold and clinical. It was the response he'd been rehearsing for years. I knew in that moment he wasn't just guessing. He knew. He had to know. The knowledge was there, in the rigid set of his shoulders, in the way he refused to meet my gaze. I pushed harder, desperation clawing at my throat. My words came out in a ragged whisper. "He touches me." Thomas's pen froze. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was vast and terrible. He looked at me then, for the first time it seemed in years. His eyes weren't filled with fatherly concern or righteous anger. They were cold with fear, a raw, primal fear, not for me, but for himself, for the name, for the money, for the comfortable, hollow life he led. "Do not," he said, his voice dangerously low, a venomous hiss that was so much worse than shouting, "ever repeat that vicious, fanciful lie again. You will ruin this family. You will ruin me." He stood up, knocking his chair back. He was a tall man, and in that moment he seemed monstrous, a monolith of denial. "Your grandfather is a great man, a good man. You are a privileged, ungrateful girl, and you will not bring this house down with your fantasies." He didn't storm out. He didn't comfort me. He simply sat back down, picked up his pen, and pretended I was no longer there. The scratching of the pen on paper resumed, each stroke a nail being hammered into the lid of my coffin. I had gone to him seeking a protector and found a second jailer. In that moment, the cage became a tomb. I was 14 and my father had just handed the shovel to my grandfather, who had been digging my grave all along. I walked back to my room in a daze. The ornate wallpaper, the canopy bed, the antique dolls staring with their glass eyes, it all seemed like the decor of a mausoleum. I understood then. There was no escape. Not through my mother's fog, not through my father's cowardice. I was a sacrifice on the altar of the Blackwood name, and the high priest and his acolyte had just confirmed my fate. The little bird in the gilded cage stopped singing that night. She began instead to sharpen her claws. Summer bled into a cold, brittle autumn, and a new kind of horror began to dawn inside me. It started as a subtle wrongness, a fatigue that settled deep in my bones, a queasiness that ambushed me in the mornings. At 15, the rhythms of my own body were still a mystery to me, but I knew, with the chilling certainty of a cornered animal, what was happening. I was carrying my grandfather's child. The realization didn't come in a single dramatic moment. It was a slow, creeping dread that tightened its grip over weeks. I would lie awake at night, my hand pressed flat against my stomach, feeling a betrayal that was more profound than any I had yet endured. My own body had become a cage within the cage, a living testament to my grandfather's sin and my father's failure. The mansion, once just oppressive, now felt predatory. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like a judgment. Every shadow in the long hallways seemed to lengthen and mock me. Richard's presence became unbearable. His knowing glances, his proprietary smiles, his casual touches that now carried the weight of this grotesque secret. It was a constant, silent torture. He seemed pleased, in a way I couldn't articulate, as if this final violation was the ultimate proof of his ownership. He would comment on my healthy glow, his words a sickening perversion of fatherly concern. My father, Thomas, retreated even further into himself. He could no longer manage to be in the same room with me. His cowardice had curdled into a palpable revulsion. He looked at me as if I were the source of the problem, the living, breathing evidence of a scandal he was desperate to ignore. In that vast, cold house, filled with staff and family, there was only one person who seemed to see my pain. Jacob, the head gardener. He was a quiet, weathered man who had worked on the estate since before I was born. He never spoke to me beyond a polite, "Miss Amelia," but his eyes, the color of the Montana sky, held a kindness that was entirely absent within the walls of the mansion. He started leaving things for me. A perfect, ripe peach on the stone bench in the rose garden. A small, carefully arranged bouquet of wildflowers on the back porch, where he knew I sometimes sat. He never waited for thanks. They were small, silent gestures of humanity in a world that had been stripped of it. He was offering sustenance, not just for the body, but for the soul. He saw the wilting bird and offered a drop of clean water, no questions asked. His quiet decency was a stark contrast to the performative benevolence of my grandfather and the hollow morality of my father. It was a reminder that goodness could exist, simple and unadorned, even in the shadow of great evil. That small, unspoken kindness from a near stranger gave me a sliver of strength, just enough to do what I knew I had to do next. The autumn leaves had turned to mulch under a blanket of early snow when I knew I could no longer hide it. My clothes were growing tight, the morning sickness more violent. I had to face my father again. This time I didn't go to his study. I waited for him in the grand foyer, standing directly in his path as he came in from a trip to town, his cheeks red from the cold. He stopped short when he saw me, his expression a mixture of annoyance and alarm. Before he could speak, before he could retreat behind his wall of denial, I said the words, "I'm pregnant." The color drained from his face. He looked, for the first time, truly terrified. Not of me, but of the irrefutable, biological proof of the secret he had tried to bury. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh, and pulled me into the nearest room, a small, unused parlor. He shut the door, his movements frantic. "Who?" he hissed. though the answer was written all over his face. I just stared at him. My silence, a more damning accusation than any word I could have spoken. And then, he broke. All the pretense, all the years of practiced indifference, shattered. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I knew," he whispered, his voice choked with a pathetic, self-pitying despair. "God help me, I suspected. I saw the way he looked at you. But what could I do? He's my father. He holds everything." He looked up at me, his eyes pleading, not for my forgiveness, but for my understanding of his weakness. "It's too late," he rasped, the words a final, cowardly surrender. "It's too late to do anything now." Those words, "it's too late," were not an apology. They were an absolution, a final washing of his hands. He was absolving himself of responsibility. And in that moment of his complete and utter collapse, something inside me shifted. The fear that had been my constant companion for years began to recede, replaced by a cold, clear, and focused calm. He was right. It was too late for him to be a father. It was too late for him to save me. But it wasn't too late for me. He thought the game was over, that all that was left was damage control. He didn't realize that I was about to change the rules. I was no longer the frightened girl pleading for help. I was the keeper of a secret that could destroy them all, and I was finally ready to use it. A few nights later, a secret meeting was convened in the library, the scene of my original violation. It was Richard, Thomas, and a new player, Dr. Miller, the family physician whose loyalty was bought and paid for by Blackwood money. They had summoned me, but they didn't speak to me. They spoke about me, as if I were a logistical problem, a stain on their reputation that needed to be discreetly scrubbed away. Richard, ever the benevolent patriarch, led the discussion. "The girl has found herself in a delicate situation," he said, his voice smooth as polished wood. "A youthful indiscretion that we must handle with compassion and, of course, discretion." Thomas sat silently, staring into the cold fireplace, a portrait of impotent misery. Dr. Miller, a small, nervous man, nodded along, eager to please. Their plan was simple and cruel. They would send me away to a special school for troubled girls in another state. It was a facility designed to make inconvenient pregnancies disappear. I would have the baby in secret, it would be given up for adoption to a family far away, and I would return a year later, the trouble neatly erased. I would be expected to be grateful for their generosity in covering up my shame. They discussed my future, my body, and my child as if they were closing a business deal. I listened, my face a mask of calm, letting them lay out their entire strategy. I was no longer Amelia, the victim. I was a chess player, watching my opponents move their pieces, revealing their weaknesses. When they finally finished, the room fell silent. Richard looked at me, a condescending smile on his face. "This is for the best, Amelia. You'll see." That was my cue. I looked not at Richard, but directly at my father, Thomas. "I'll go," I said, my voice steady and clear. The relief on their faces was immediate and disgusting. "But I have conditions." Richard's smile tightened. "Conditions?" "The baby will not be given up for adoption," I stated. "He will be brought back here, to Harmony Creek." Dr. Miller sputtered, but Richard held up a hand, intrigued. Thomas looked at me, a new kind of fear in his eyes. This was not the script he had imagined. "He?" Richard asked, a flicker of something, pride, curiosity, in his eyes. "I know it's a boy," I said, a lie that felt truer than anything. "And he will be raised in this house." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle in the suffocating silence. Then I delivered the final, critical move. "Thomas," I said, my gaze locking onto my father's, "you and Mother will adopt him. He will be raised as your son, as my brother." The room exploded. Thomas shot to his feet. "Amelia, that's insane! It's impossible!" Richard stared at me, his mind clearly working, calculating the angles of this new, unexpected development. He saw the poetry of it, the twisted legacy. But it was Thomas I was speaking to. It was Thomas I was breaking. I stood up and faced him, all the power in the room now mine. "It's not a request. It's a final offer. You will raise my son as your own, in this house, under your father's nose. You will give him the Blackwood name. Or, when I turn 18, I will walk into the office of the Harmony Creek Chronicle, and I will tell them everything. I will tell them about the special lessons. I will tell them whose son this really is, and I will burn this family to the ground. Your choice. Thomas was trapped. Richard, for all his power, couldn't stop me without revealing his own guilt. My father looked from me to his own father and saw no escape. He was caught between the monster who created him and the monster he had helped create. In that moment, he saw that my revenge would not be a single, fiery explosion. It would be a slow, quiet, lifelong sentence. He would have to look at the face of his own failure every single day. He would have to love the child born of the crime he allowed to happen. He slumped back into his chair, utterly defeated. "I accept," he whispered. And in the silent, poisoned library, the deal with the devil was struck. But they still hadn't realized. I was the devil in this negotiation now. My exile was a quiet, gray affair. I was sent to a discreet boarding school on the misty coast of Oregon, a place where girls with secrets went to wait. I read books. I walked along the cold, windswept beach, and I felt the life inside me grow. I was no longer just a victim. I was a vessel for my own vengeance. When the time came, I gave birth to a healthy baby boy with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that, I prayed, would not resemble his father's. I named him David. I held him for only a day before they took him away, not to strangers, but back to the architects of my suffering. A few months later, I returned to Harmony Creek. The town was told I had been studying abroad. I played the part, speaking of art museums and foreign languages. Inside, I was counting the days. Then came the announcement. Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood, in a surprising and philanthropic gesture, had adopted a baby boy. The town buzzed with the news. They praised the Blackwoods for their generosity, for opening their home to an orphan. They called it a blessing. Thomas and Eleanor hosted a small gathering to introduce David to their close circle. I stood in the corner of the grand drawing room, watching my father hold my son. Thomas's hands trembled slightly. He smiled for the guests, a pained, brittle thing that didn't reach his eyes. Eleanor, in her usual medicated haze, cooed at the baby, calling him a little angel. And Richard, my grandfather, stood over the bassinet, looking down at the child, his own son, with a strange, triumphant gleam in his eyes. He thought he had won. He thought he had secured his lineage, planting his seed in the next generation, albeit through a circuitous route. He put his hand on Thomas's shoulder and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "He has the Blackwood look, doesn't he? Strong genes." The irony was so thick, it was suffocating. My revenge had begun. It was not a loud, fiery retribution, but a quiet, insidious poison that would now seep into the foundations of the house. Every day, Thomas would have to be a father to the evidence of his own cowardice. He would have to teach David to walk and talk, to love and trust him, all while knowing the monstrous truth. Richard would have to watch his own son grow up, calling him great-grandfather. He would have to watch Thomas receive the praise and affection that he, in his twisted mind, believed was rightfully his. The mansion was no longer just a cage. It was a stage. And I had cast them all in a play where they would be forced to act out their roles for the rest of their lives, with me as the silent, ever-present audience. I accepted my new role in the town's narrative, Amelia Blackwood, the quiet, bookish spinster, the devoted sister-aunt. I was a fixture in the house, a permanent reminder of the secret they all had to keep. My very presence was a weapon. The game was set, the pieces were in place, and I had a lifetime to watch them play. The years that followed were a masterclass in psychological torture. The Blackwood mansion became a pressure cooker of unspoken truths and simmering resentment. On the surface, we were a family. We had dinner together every night. We celebrated birthdays and holidays, but beneath the veneer of civility, the house was a war zone of silent glances and heavy sighs. My life became a study in quiet observation. I watched as David grew from a baby into a bright, inquisitive boy. He was a happy child, oblivious to the toxic currents swirling around him. His laughter, which should have brought joy to the house, was often a source of immense tension. I saw the way my father, Thomas, would flinch whenever David would run to him and yell, "Daddy!" His smile in return was always strained, his touch hesitant. He was a good father in all the practical ways. He read bedtime stories, he helped with homework, he taught David how to fish. But there was always a chasm between them, a space filled with the guilt that Thomas could never voice. He began to drink more, his evenings spent in his study with a glass of whiskey that never seemed to be empty. It was his only solace, a way to numb the constant gnawing reminder of his failure. Richard, on the other hand, was fascinated by David. He would watch the boy for hours, a look of sick, proprietary pride on his face. He saw his own traits in David, the boy's confidence, his quick temper, his sharp intelligence. "He's a true Blackwood," Richard would declare at dinner, raising a toast to the boy, his eyes gleaming. He would try to usurp Thomas's role, buying David extravagant gifts, telling him stories of the family's legacy, trying to mold him in his own image. This, of course, created a new source of conflict. The arguments between Richard and Thomas became more frequent, hushed, angry exchanges behind the closed doors of the library. They were fighting over the boy, each of them claiming a right to him for reasons David could never comprehend. My role in this daily drama was one of strategic silence. I was the ghost at the feast, the quiet spinster aunt who lived upstairs. And my presence was a constant low-grade fever in the house. When Thomas would look at me, he saw his betrayal. When Richard looked at me, he saw his undefeated partner in a dark secret. They could never forget what they had done, because I was always there, a living, breathing archive of their sins. The town, of course, saw none of this. They saw the tragic figure of Amelia Blackwood, the girl whose fiancé had died in a car crash, a story my father had invented to explain why I never married. They pitied me. "Such a shame," they'd whisper at the general store, "to devote her whole life to her little brother." Little did they know, my devotion was not to David, but to the slow, meticulous destruction of the men who had wronged me. The House of Blackwood was no longer a home. It was my personal panopticon, and the inmates were beginning to crack. The first major fissure appeared when David was about 10 years old. His resemblance to Richard was becoming undeniable. It wasn't just the dark hair or the sharp jawline. It was the way he stood, the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, the flash of arrogance in his eyes when he won a game. It was nature triumphing over nurture in the most damning way possible. Strangers would comment on it. "My, he's the spitting image of your father," they'd say to Thomas, who would just force a tight smile and change the subject. The strain was beginning to wear Thomas down. His drinking escalated from an evening habit to a constant companion. He became gaunt, his eyes perpetually bloodshot. The arguments with Richard grew louder, no longer confined to the library. I would hear their raised voices from down the hall, arguing about David's schooling, his future, his inheritance. Richard wanted to send him to an elite boarding school back east, the same one he and Thomas had attended. Thomas, in a rare act of defiance, refused. He wanted to keep David close, a desperate, pathetic attempt to cling to the role of father that he was so miserably failing to perform. The tension came to a head one night at the dinner table. It was a formal affair, as always. The table was set with the family silver and china. Thomas, already half drunk, was sullen and silent. Richard was holding court, regaling David with stories of his own youthful achievements. I was watching, as always. David, in a moment of childish curiosity, turned to me. "Amelia," he asked, his voice clear and innocent in the suddenly quiet room. "Why did you never get married?" The air froze. A fork clattered against a plate. Thomas choked on his wine. Richard's face became an unreadable mask. All eyes were on me. The lie they had constructed, the dead fiancé, hung in the air between us. It was a simple, guileless question, but it struck at the very heart of the lie we were all living. I looked at David, my son, my brother, and I felt a pang of something that was almost pity. He was the only innocent one at the table. I gave him a small, sad smile. "I guess I just never met the right person," I said softly. But my eyes were on my father, and in them, he saw the truth I wasn't speaking. "You made sure of that." The rest of the dinner passed in absolute silence. The lie had been exposed, not by a grand confrontation, but by the innocent question of a child. The cracks in the foundation of the House of Blackwood were spreading, and I knew it was only a matter of time before the whole rotten structure came crashing down. The pressure was building, and I was content to wait, knowing that the final act was yet to come. The final act began, as so many things did in our family, with Richard on a bed. Not in the library, but in his own cavernous bedroom, propped up against a mountain of pillows, his once robust body withered by a series of strokes. He was dying. He had summoned the family to his bedside, the king on his deathbed, preparing to issue his final decrees. Thomas was there, looking old and defeated, smelling faintly of whiskey. David, now a young man of 18, stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of his role in this final, somber scene. And I was there, the patient spectator waiting for the curtain to fall. Richard's voice was a weak, papery rasp, but his eyes still held that familiar, arrogant gleam. He thought, even in death, that he was in control. He thought he had won. He motioned for David to come closer. "David!" he wheezed, reaching out a trembling hand. You are my legacy, the future of this family. Everything I have built, it is for you." He was trying to bypass Thomas, to claim David as his true heir in spirit, if not in name. He looked from David to me, a faint, triumphant smile on his lips. It was his last little victory, he thought, ensuring his bloodline continued, cared for by the very people he had manipulated. Thomas stood by, saying nothing, his face a mask of misery. He was too broken to even fight this final indignity. The doctor had said Richard didn't have long, that his mind was clear, but his body was failing. This was my moment, the culmination of 2 decades of silent, patient waiting. After David and Thomas had left the room, I stayed behind, pulling a chair close to the bed. I leaned in, my voice a soft, intimate whisper against his ear, the same way he used to whisper his lessons to me. "You think you've won, don't you?" I murmured. His eyes fluttered open, confused. "You think David is your great-grandson, your legacy, the ultimate proof of the Blackwood strength." I let the words hang in the air for a moment. "But you're wrong. That's not the secret I've been keeping all these years." I watched the confusion in his eyes turn to a flicker of alarm. "David isn't your great-grandson, Richard," I whispered, the words precise and deadly. "He's your son. And the greatest humiliation of your life isn't that you're dying. It's that you had to watch your own weak, pathetic, cowardly son raise him for you. You had to listen to everyone praise Thomas's child. Your legacy isn't a triumph. It's a joke, and you're the punchline." The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The blood drained from his face. His eyes went wide with a horror so profound it seemed to stop his heart right there. The carefully constructed world of his own ego, the narrative of power and control he had built his entire life, crumbled to dust in a single moment. He tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound came out. His body convulsed, a massive final stroke triggered by the pure, undiluted shock of the truth. He died not in peace, not as the triumphant patriarch, but in terror, staring at the face of the girl he had destroyed, finally understanding that she had, in the end, destroyed him right back. The death of the king plunged the kingdom into chaos. With Richard gone, the force that had held the family's rotten structure together disappeared. Thomas, unmoored from the twin anchors of his father's tyranny and his fear, completely fell apart. A week after the funeral, I found him in the library, the room where all our tragedies began and ended. He was surrounded by empty bottles, his face blotchy and tear-stained. He had the look of a man who had been running his whole life and had finally collapsed at the finish line. When David walked in, looking for him, Thomas didn't even try to hide it anymore. The dam of secrets burst. In a rambling, slurred, and agonizing confession, he told David everything. He told him about Richard. He told him about me. He told him about the deal in the library, about the adoption, about the lie they had all lived for 18 years. He confessed, not out of a desire for forgiveness, but out of a desperate need to unburden his own shattered soul. He laid the entire grotesque history of the Blackwood family at David's feet. I stood in the doorway, listening. I did not intervene. This was Thomas's reckoning, not mine. I watched David's face as the story unfolded. His world was being systematically dismantled, word by painful word. The man he called his father was his grandfather. The woman he called his great-grandfather was his father. And the woman he called his sister was his mother. When Thomas finally fell silent, sobbing into his hands, David didn't look at him. He looked at me. His face was a canvas of shock, pain, and dawning, horrific understanding. There was no anger in his eyes, not for me. There was only a profound, shared sorrow. He saw me, truly saw me for the first time, not as his quiet aunt, but as a fellow victim, the primary victim, of the man who had sired them both. He understood, in that terrible moment, the depth of my sacrifice and the cold, calculated brilliance of my revenge. He realized his entire life had been a weapon in my hands. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked out of the library, out of the mansion, and soon after, out of Harmony Creek. He didn't need to say anything. We both understood that we were the survivors of a war we never chose to fight. I am an old woman now, the sole occupant of this decaying mansion. Thomas is gone. The whiskey that was his only comfort finally claimed him a few years after Richard's death. He's buried next to his father in the family plot, a final, ironic act of submission. The house is quiet, the halls filled only with echoes and dust. The gilded cage is rusted and empty. David moved far away, to a city by the ocean. He changed his name, severing the last tie to the Blackwood legacy. He built a new life for himself, one free of the poison of Harmony Creek. He has never come back. But every year, on my birthday, a postcard arrives. It's always a picture of the ocean, vast and gray and endless. There's never a message, never a signature. But I know it's from him. It's a silent acknowledgement, a shared language between two people bound by an unspeakable truth. It's not forgiveness, and it's not love. It's something more elemental. It's recognition. He sees me, and he understands. I don't know if I found justice. Justice is a clean, simple word, and my story is a tangled, messy thing. I didn't seek forgiveness, from David or from God. I didn't seek happiness. I sought only balance, an eye for an eye, a soul for a soul. I took the pain they gave me, and I crafted it into a key. I unlocked their cages and watched them destroy themselves. My grandfather wanted a legacy. Now, he is a story of rot whispered in a dying town. My father wanted to protect his name. Now, his name is a synonym for cowardice, buried with him in the cold Montana earth. I am the last Blackwood left in this house of ghosts. I sit in the library, surrounded by the silent witnesses of my past, and I feel a strange sense of peace. The bird in the gilded cage may have never learned to fly, but she learned to dismantle the cage, piece by painful piece. They thought it was too late to do anything, but they were wrong. It is never too late to plant a seed of truth in a garden of lies and wait, for a lifetime if you must, to watch what grows. By 15, the monster my grandfather had planted in me began to grow. It started as a subtle betrayal, a sickness in the morning that left my mouth tasting of bile and my head spinning with a dizzying vertigo. Then came the thickening around my waist, a slow, undeniable rounding that no amount of wishful thinking could flatten. The terror was absolute, a cold, heavy stone lodged in my gut that radiated a perpetual chill through my entire being. It was a physical manifestation of the secret I carried, a living, growing testament to my violation. I began to live in baggy clothes, drowning my changing form in layers of shapeless wool and cotton, praying the world would see only a gawky teenager and not the horrifying truth blooming beneath the fabric. I starved myself, hoping to shrink the life inside me, hoping to punish my own body for its treachery. I prayed to a God who had clearly abandoned Harmony Creek, whose silence was as profound and damning as my father's. My pleas echoed in the cavernous emptiness of my room, unanswered, unheard. In that suffocating loneliness, one person saw past my carefully constructed facade. Jacob, the groundskeeper. He was a quiet, weathered man, his face a road map of sun and wind, his hands calloused from a lifetime of coaxing life from the soil. He rarely spoke, his words as sparse and deliberate as the winter trees. But he saw. He started leaving things for me on the cool stone of the back porch steps, where I often sat to escape the oppressive air of the mansion. The first time, it was a single perfect apple, polished to a high sheen. I found it nestled beside the railing, a silent offering. A few days later, a small sandwich wrapped in wax paper, the bread still soft. Then a wildflower, a fragile splash of purple plucked from the edge of the woods. He never said a word, never sought acknowledgement. When our paths crossed, he would just give a slow, deliberate nod, his eyes, the color of faded denim, holding a depth of understanding that unnerved and comforted me in equal measure. He saw a creature in pain, a wounded animal hiding in plain sight, and he was the only soul in that entire damn town who offered kindness without a price, without an agenda. His silent gifts were more than sustenance. They were a lifeline, a quiet acknowledgement that I still existed as a person, not just a problem. There was no hiding it anymore. The sickness had abated, but the growth had not. My small bump, once concealable, was now a definite curve, a testament to my father's monumental failure. I found him in the upstairs hallway, the one lined with portraits of our Blackwood ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow my every move. The fading afternoon light cast long, distorted shadows, making the corridor feel like a tunnel with no exit. He was on his way to his study, a book tucked under his arm, a look of placid self-satisfaction on his face. The sight of it, the sheer normalcy of his existence, ignited a spark of rage in the cold dread that filled me. I stepped in front of him, blocking his path. He looked down at me, his brow furrowing with mild annoyance. The words tumbled out of me in a choked, desperate whisper, raw and ragged. "I'm pregnant. It's his." For a moment, he didn't seem to process it. The words hung in the still, heavy air between us. Then, his face changed. It wasn't anger at his father, the monster who had done this. It wasn't sorrow or compassion for me, his daughter. It was pure, pathetic terror. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving behind a pasty, grayish pallor. He saw a scandal, a stain, a threat to the carefully curated perfection of his life. He grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and half-dragged, half-steered me into the sanctuary of his study, closing the heavy oak door behind us with a soft, final click. The room smelled of old leather, pipe tobacco, and fear. His fear. "No, no, no," he muttered, releasing me and beginning to pace the length of the Persian rug, his hands raking through his perfectly combed hair. He moved like a caged animal, his steps frantic and without purpose. He looked at me, his daughter, the victim of his own father's depravity, and all he saw was a complication that would undo him, that would tarnish the gleaming Blackwood name. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of his frantic footsteps and my own ragged breathing. He finally stopped, his shoulders slumped in utter defeat, his back to me as he stared out the window at the manicured lawns. He uttered the words that would extinguish the last ember of hope inside me and forge my life's mission in its place. "My God, Amelia," he breathed, his voice a hollow shell. "What can we do? It's too late. It's too late to do anything." He turned then, and his eyes, for the first time, were stripped of all pretense. In them, I saw the confession he would never speak aloud. He admitted he'd known, not in a way he could prove, but in the gut-deep way a person knows a terrible truth they are desperate to ignore. He had suspected. He had seen the way his father looked at me, had noticed the closed library door, had felt the shift in the very atmosphere of our home, and he had done nothing. He was a coward, a man who chose his father's comfort and the family's reputation over his own daughter's life. In that moment, he ceased to be my father. He became just another man who had betrayed me. A secret council was held in the very room where my innocence was stolen, the library. The air was thick with the scent of whiskey and stale cigar smoke, a malevolent perfume. It was me, my father Thomas, my grandfather Richard, and Dr. Miller, the town's physician and Richard's most loyal dog. I sat in a high-backed chair, a small, still point in a vortex of male calculation. I was not the victim. I was a complication, a stain to be scrubbed out before it set. They spoke about me as if I weren't there, their voices low and conspiratorial. My existence had been reduced to a logistical problem. Richard, with a chilling, almost paternal calm, laid out the plan. His voice was smooth, reasonable, the voice of a philanthropist discussing a new wing for the hospital. I was to be sent away, he explained, to a finishing school for troubled girls in the desolate plains of Utah. It was a place for secrets, a place where inconvenient daughters disappeared for a season or two. I would have the baby there, in absolute secrecy. The child, this unwanted fruit of his sin, would be given up for adoption to a good, anonymous family far away. I would then return to Harmony Creek, cleansed, my troubles behind me, the slate wiped clean. My father just nodded, his head bobbing in pathetic agreement, a puppet on a string, his eyes fixed on a point on the floor. He was relieved. They had found a solution that required no courage from him. But in that room, watching these three men plot the systematic erasure of my life and my child's, something inside me didn't just break, it hardened into something cold and sharp, like steel. The fear was still there, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was now overlaid with a glacial, clarifying rage. They thought they had won. They had neatly solved their problem. They hadn't realized the war was just beginning. I waited. I let them finish their plotting, their self-congratulatory murmurs about handling a delicate situation with such discretion. Later, after Dr. Miller had scurried away and Richard had retired to his chambers, I found my father alone in the hallway, pouring himself another drink. I approached him, my steps silent on the thick carpet. He flinched when he saw me. "It's for the best, Amelia," he started, his voice weak. I cut him off. My own voice was devoid of all emotion, a flat, dead thing. "I'll go," I said. He looked relieved for a fraction of a second. "I'll have the baby." I paused, letting the silence hang between us, letting him absorb my compliance. Then I delivered the first blow in my long war. "But it's not being given away." His brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about? The plan is—" "He's coming home," I stated, my eyes locking onto his. "He's coming back to Harmony Creek." I let that sink in before delivering the rest. "And you, Father, are going to raise him. He will be your son, my brother." Thomas stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, the color draining from his face once more. The glass in his hand trembled. "You're insane," he whispered, a tremor of real fear in his voice now. It wasn't fear of scandal anymore. It was fear of me. I smiled then, a thin, cold thing that didn't reach my eyes. It was the first real smile I'd felt in months, and it was terrifying. "Refuse," I said, my voice as soft and sharp as a shard of glass. "And the day I turn 18, I will burn this family to the ground. I will walk into the office of the Harmony Creek Chronicle, and I will tell the world what he did, and what you let him do." I watched his eyes flicker from my face to the grand, oil-painted portrait of his father that dominated the hallway. He was trapped, caught between the monster he feared and the monster his daughter had just become, and I, his 14-year-old daughter, the girl they thought they could discard, held the key to his cage. In that moment, I knew he would agree. The coward's choice is always the one that preserves the self, and I had just made his own survival contingent on my revenge. My time in Utah was a gray, featureless expanse, a purgatory of waiting. The finishing school was a drab, isolated building populated by other girls with secrets, all of us ghosts haunting the windswept landscape. I did what I was told. I ate, I slept, I grew, and I nurtured the cold, hard core of my plan. When the time came, the pain was a fire that burned away the last vestiges of the girl I had been. And then he was there, a small, perfect being, his cry filling the sterile silence of the room. They let me hold him for only a moment, but it was long enough. I looked into his face and saw not my grandfather, not the monster, but a life, my son. And I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that I was doing the right thing. My return to Harmony Creek was quiet, The town's gossips whispered, of course. Amelia Blackwood, sent away for nervous exhaustion, now returned, thinner, paler, with a new, unsettling stillness about her. I played the part of the fragile convalescent, speaking little, my eyes downcast. I let them think what they wanted. Their petty speculations were gnats buzzing around the monumental truth of my purpose. A few months passed, a long, tense autumn that bled into a bitter winter. And then the performance began. My father and Eleanor, my tranquilized, ghost-like mother, made the announcement. They had decided, in an act of profound Christian charity, to adopt a baby boy, an orphan who needed a loving home. It was a carefully orchestrated story, delivered to a select group of the town's most influential matrons over tea and scones. My father, his face a mask of strained benevolence, spoke of a calling, a desire to give back. I watched from the corner of the drawing room, a silent, spectral observer. And then David came home. He was presented to the world as David Blackwood, son of Thomas and Eleanor, the newest heir to the family fortune. And the first act of my revenge began, a slow, silent psychological torture designed to last a lifetime. Every day became a new scene in this grim play. My father, Thomas, was forced to play the doting father to the child born of the very crime he had so cowardly ignored. Every time the baby cooed, every time he reached for him with tiny, trusting hands, I would watch the muscles in my father's jaw clench, see the flicker of agony and revulsion in his eyes before he forced it down, replacing it with a hollow smile. He was living his punishment day by day, breath by breath. Richard, my grandfather, the architect of my ruin, was subjected to a more subtle, more exquisite torment. He had to watch his own son, the product of his vile secret, be raised as his great-grandson. He had to listen as visitors cooed over the baby, remarking on the strong Blackwood genes, pointing out a resemblance to Richard himself in the shape of the boy's eyes or the set of his jaw. He would preen, accepting the compliments with a smug, proprietary pride, completely oblivious to the depth of the irony. He believed he was witnessing the continuation of his legacy, while I knew he was watching the living, breathing evidence of his ultimate humiliation. My presence was the catalyst, the constant, silent pressure on these two festering wounds. I was the ghost at their feast, the skeleton in their closet, walking and breathing among them. Every glance from me was a reminder. Every shared silence was an accusation. The great Blackwood mansion, once my gilded cage, had become my theater, and my tormentors were now the lead actors in a tragedy of my own design. The mansion, once a symbol of Blackwood power and prestige, transformed into a high-pressure vessel of unspoken truths. The air grew thick with things left unsaid, so heavy it felt difficult to breathe. Polished surfaces reflected strained faces, and the deep, plush carpet seemed to absorb the sound of joyful life, leaving only a tense, muffled quiet. This was the House of Whispers, where the loudest sounds were the ones no one dared to make. My life settled into a strange monastic routine. I became Aunt Amelia, the quiet, unmarried woman who drifted through the grand rooms like a shadow. I managed the household accounts, planned the menus, and oversaw the staff with a cool, detached efficiency. My silence was my weapon, my constant presence, my indictment. I didn't need to raise my voice or make accusations. I simply had to exist. My existence was a living, breathing memory of their sins, a memory they could not escape. The daily torture was a masterpiece of subtlety. At the dinner table, a nightly ritual of dread, David's innocent laughter would echo in the cavernous dining room, and my father would flinch as if struck. When David, as a toddler, would climb into Thomas's lap and pat his cheek with a sticky hand, my father's smile was a ghastly rictus of pain. He was trapped in the role of loving father, a role that was a constant, searing reminder of his cowardice. Richard, on the other hand, reveled in David's presence. He saw in the boy a mirror of himself, a chance at a legacy untainted by Thomas's perceived weakness. He would sit David on his knee in the very library where he had destroyed my childhood, reading him stories of great kings and conquerors, his voice booming with sick, proprietary pride. "This boy has the true Blackwood spirit," he would declare to Thomas, who could only nod mutely, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. I would watch these scenes unfold from the doorway, a silent sentinel. My impassive face was a mirror reflecting their own guilt back at them. They saw in my eyes, not hatred, but something far worse, knowledge. I knew the truth, and my quiet, unblinking gaze was a promise that the truth would never be buried. The town of Harmony Creek accepted my new role without question. I was the spinster aunt, a tragic but respectable figure. Such a shame, the ladies at the church bake sale would murmur, that Amelia Blackwood never found a husband. So devoted to her family. I let them build their narrative. I accepted the role of the quiet, self-sacrificing woman who had given up her life for her family. The irony was so potent, so bitter, it was almost sweet. I was devoted to my family, but not in the way they imagined. I was devoted to their slow, meticulous unraveling. Each day, I was the one who ensured the house ran perfectly, that their comforts were met, that the facade of Blackwood perfection remained pristine for the outside world. I was the warden of their beautiful, agonizing prison, and I was content to serve my life sentence, as long as they were forced to serve theirs alongside me. The years spooled out, measured not in dates on a calendar, but in the slow, inexorable growth of David. The seasons turned, painting the manicured lawns of the Blackwood estate in the vibrant greens of spring, the lush golds of autumn, and the stark, unforgiving white of winter. And with each passing year, the cracks in the family's facade began to spiderweb, growing deeper and more impossible to ignore. David grew from a curious toddler into a bright, inquisitive boy, and then into a young man whose features began to settle into a familiar, terrifying pattern. The resemblance was no longer a matter of passing comment. It was an undeniable, shouting fact. He had Richard's sharp, intelligent eyes, his confident posture, the same stubborn set to his jaw. He was a living ghost, a youthful echo of the old man, and his presence in the house became a source of ever-increasing, unbearable tension. The strain began to wear my father down, eroding him from the inside out. Thomas sought refuge in the bottle, his days measured by the clinking of ice in a glass. He became a man of shadows and sighs, his conversations with his son growing more stilted and fraught. He could barely look at David without seeing the specter of his own failure. The arguments between Thomas and Richard became more frequent, more venomous. They fought over David's future. Richard, swelling with a monstrous pride, wanted to mold David in his own image. He envisioned him at the helm of the Blackwood Enterprises, a ruthless, brilliant titan of industry. He pushed for boarding schools in the East, for business tutors, for a path paved with power and influence. Thomas, in a rare display of paternal instinct, or perhaps just a desperate attempt to put distance between the boy and his true father, fought back. He argued for a normal life, for public school in Harmony Creek, for a childhood unburdened by the crushing weight of the Blackwood name. Their shouting matches would echo through the cavernous halls, with David at the center of a tug-of-war he could not comprehend. And then came the evening that shattered the fragile, poisoned peace for good. We were all at the dinner table, the four of us, trapped in our customary tableau of silent tension. David, now a teenager with a mind of his own, had been quiet throughout the meal, watching the strained interactions between his father and great-grandfather. He put down his fork, the small sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He looked at me, his gaze direct and filled with a simple, guileless curiosity. "Aunt Amelia," he asked, his voice clear and steady, "why did you never get married?" The question fell into the room like a stone into a silent pond. The air crackled. The world seemed to stop. I saw my father's hand, which had been reaching for his wine glass, freeze in midair. A piece of roast beef slipped from his fork and fell to his plate with a soft, wet sound. Richard, who had been holding forth about some business deal, stopped mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open. The carefully constructed artifice of our lives, the web of lies we had been spinning for over a decade, was suddenly laid bare by one innocent question. All eyes turned to me. My father's were filled with panic, pleading with me to say something, anything, to patch the hole that had just been torn in our reality. Richard's eyes were narrow, a flicker of old suspicion rekindled within them. In that moment, I held all their fragile realities in my hand. I met David's gaze, my own expression unreadable. I offered a small, sad, and practiced smile. "I suppose I just never met the right person," I said softly. "I was always happy enough right here, watching you grow up." The answer was simple, believable, the lie the town had already accepted. But in the suffocating silence of that dining room, it sounded like a scream. It was a lie so profound, so enormous, that it exposed the truth more effectively than any confession ever could. The spell was broken. The unspoken had been touched upon, and the House of Whispers would never be quiet again. Richard's decline was slow, then swift, as if his body were finally succumbing to the long, festering rot in his soul. He ended his days in the grand master bedroom, a room that smelled of antiseptic, wilting flowers, and decay. He was a shrunken figure against the pristine white pillows, his once booming voice reduced to a dry, rattling whisper. But even on the precipice of death, his arrogance remained undiminished. He called us all to his bedside: Thomas, a haunted, trembling wreck; me, a silent, patient observer; and David, the bright, handsome young man who was the unknowing centerpiece of this entire tragedy. Richard, propped up on his pillows, thought he was presiding over his final victory. He reached a trembling, skeletal hand toward David. "You," he rasped, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light. "You are my true heir. My legacy." He looked from David's face to Thomas's, a flicker of old contempt in his gaze. He believed he had won, that his bloodline, his spirit, would continue, strong and pure, through this boy. He believed he was leaving the world as a patriarch, a king, his kingdom secure. He was preparing to die in peace, swaddled in the comfort of his final grand illusion. That was a comfort I could not allow. After Thomas had helped a confused and unsettled David from the room, I remained behind. I moved to the side of the bed, the afternoon light casting my shadow over him. He looked up at me, his breathing shallow. "He'll do us proud," he wheezed, a self-satisfied smirk on his chapped lips. I leaned in close, so close that my breath stirred the wisps of white hair on his temple. My voice was a whisper, a secret meant only for him, the final, devastating truth delivered in the confessional quiet of his death chamber. "He's not your legacy, Richard," I murmured, my voice as soft and cold as graveyard soil. "He is not your great-grandson." I saw the confusion in his eyes, a flicker of fear. I pressed on, delivering the killing blow. "David is your son. And the greatest humiliation of your life is that you had to stand by and watch your own cowardly, pathetic child raise him as his own." The truth hit him like a physical blow. His eyes widened in pure, undiluted horror. The smugness vanished, replaced by a dawning, soul-shattering comprehension. He understood. He understood the years of watching Thomas's pain, the irony of his own pride, the sheer, perfect magnitude of my revenge. He tried to speak, but only a choked, gurgling sound emerged. His face contorted, a mask of terror. His body convulsed once, a violent, ugly shudder, and then he was still. Richard Blackwood did not die in peace. He died in a state of absolute, screaming horror, his last moments a glimpse into the hell he had created. I watched, my heart a steady, even drum in my chest. I felt no joy, no triumph, only a grim, quiet sense of balance, finally, terribly restored. The death of the patriarch did not free Thomas. It shattered him. Richard had been the sun around which my father's life had orbited, a source of both terror and definition. Without him, Thomas collapsed into himself like a dying star. The dam of his denial, built over decades of cowardice and willful ignorance, finally broke. A few nights after the funeral, fueled by a bottle of whiskey and a lifetime of self-loathing, he summoned David to the library. I knew what was coming. I stood in the darkened hallway, just outside the slightly ajar door, a silent witness to the final act of destruction. It was not a neat or noble confession. It was a ragged, rambling, tear-soaked torrent of words. Thomas, his face blotchy and his voice thick with liquor and grief, unburdened his soul. He told David everything. He spoke of his own father's monstrosity, of the special lessons in the library, of my desperate plea for help when I was 14. He confessed his own terror, his cowardice, his complicity. He told David about the pregnancy, the secret council, the deal I had forced upon him. And then, with a sob that seemed to tear from the very depths of his being, he delivered the final, world-altering truth. "He's not your great-grandfather, David," he wept, his words slurring. "He was your father. And Amelia is not your aunt." Through the crack in the door, I saw David's world crumble. He stood frozen, his face a mask of disbelief, then dawning horror, then a profound, soul-crushing agony. The entire foundation of his life, his identity, his family, had been revealed as a monstrous lie. Thomas, lost in his own guilt, probably expected rage or disgust or an outburst of violence. But David's reaction was something far more devastating. His world had collapsed, and when he looked up, his gaze was not fixed on the weeping, broken man who had raised him. His eyes sought the hallway, as if he knew I was there. And then he stepped out of the library, his movements slow and deliberate, like a man moving underwater. He saw me standing in the shadows. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a pain so deep it seemed ancient. He looked at me, his mother, his sister, the architect of his entire existence. And there was no anger in his gaze. There was only a terrible, shared understanding. He saw it all in a flash of horrific clarity. The gilded cage, the stolen childhood, the reason for my silent, sorrowful existence. He realized that his own life had been the weapon in a war he never knew was being fought. In that moment, he saw that we were not perpetrator and victim, but two different kinds of survivors, both irrevocably broken by the same men. He didn't speak a word, he didn't have to. The look we shared in that dim, silent hallway was a confession, an absolution, and a eulogy all at once. We were both victims of the House of Blackwood, and we were both, finally, free of its secrets. The years fell away, like dead leaves from a dying tree. I am an old woman now, living alone in the decaying grandeur of the Blackwood mansion. The house itself is a tomb, filled with the echoes of whispers and the ghosts of lies. Dust motes dance in the slivers of sunlight that pierce the grimy windows, illuminating paths on the floor where no one walks. The velvet on the chairs is faded and worn, the silver tarnished, the portraits on the wall staring out with dark, vacant eyes. The silence is absolute, a heavy blanket that smothers all sound. Thomas is long gone, having finally drunk himself into the grave he had been digging for decades. He died in his study, surrounded by the books he never truly understood and the ghosts of the choices he never had the courage to make. David left Harmony Creek the week after the confession. He walked out of the house with a single bag and never looked back. I heard, through the ever-turning rumor mill of the town, that he had moved far away, to a city by the coast, and that he had changed his name, shedding the Blackwood identity like a snake sheds its skin. He wanted no part of the blood, the money, or the history. I cannot blame him. He cut all ties, except for one. Every year, on my birthday, a small, plain postcard arrives. It is never signed. It always bears a postmark from some new, distant coastal town. And the picture on the front is always the same, a vast, endless expanse of the ocean, the waves crashing against a shore of sand or rock. It is a silent acknowledgement, a fragile, painful thread connecting two solitary survivors across a continent of pain. It is his way of saying, I know, I understand, I remember. I sit here now, in the fading light, the postcard in my old, wrinkled hand. I never sought forgiveness, for myself or for them. Forgiveness is a gentle rain, and our story was one of fire and ice. I sought only balance, an eye for an eye, a life for a life, a truth for a lie. My revenge was not a single swift act, but a slow, creeping vine that choked the life from this house and the men who ruled it. They built my prison, and I made sure they lived and died within its walls. There is a terrible, grim satisfaction in that, a sense of an equation finally solved. Looking out over the overgrown gardens where Jacob once left me wildflowers, I know that my war is over. The price was my own life, my own chance at happiness. but it was a price I chose to pay. I planted a seed of truth in a garden of lies, and I watched as it grew, its roots tearing down everything in their path. It is never too late for that. I returned to Harmony Creek, not with the fanfare of a prodigal daughter, but with the quiet slip of a phantom through a forgotten door. The year away at the specialized boarding school for troubled girls, a gilded cage in a state I couldn't name, had hollowed me out, sculpting my face into a mask of placid indifference. I was a vessel, emptied of the girl I had been and refilled with something cold, patient, and purposeful. The Blackwood mansion received me in silence. My father, Thomas, could not meet my eyes, his gaze perpetually fixed on a point just over my shoulder, as if studying the ghost of his own cowardice that followed me. My grandfather, Richard, the architect of my ruin, greeted me with a proprietary smile, his eyes sweeping over me with the satisfaction of a collector examining a prized, albeit slightly damaged, possession. He saw my return as his victory, a reassertion of his absolute control. He was wrong. My compliance was not surrender. It was the first move in a war he didn't even know had been declared. The house settled into a new, brittle rhythm. I moved through its opulent, suffocating rooms like a wraith, my presence a low hum of unease beneath the surface of their carefully constructed lives. Eleanor, my mother, floated in her laudanum-laced fog, offering gentle, confused smiles, her memory of my absence as hazy as her perception of my return. For her, time was a placid river with no sharp turns. For Thomas and Richard, my silence was a coiled serpent in the heart of their home. Every meal was a trial, every shared hallway, a tightrope walk over a chasm of unspoken truth. I didn't need to scream or accuse. I just needed to be there to exist, a living testament to the secret they had buried. A few months after my return, as the first chill of autumn began to crisp the edges of the maple leaves lining our long driveway, the second act of my long revenge was set in motion. Richard and Thomas convened a formal dinner. The fine china was laid out, the crystal glasses gleamed under the chandelier, and the air was thick with a cloying, performative normalcy. After the roast had been carved and the wine poured, my father, his hand trembling so slightly that only I would notice, cleared his throat. "Eleanor, my dear," he began, his voice a strained imitation of cheerful authority. "Amelia, Richard, we have some wonderful news to share." Eleanor blinked slowly, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "Oh, how lovely, Thomas." Richard leaned back in his chair, a benevolent patriarch presiding over his domain. He knew what was coming. He had orchestrated it. This was the final step in sanitizing his crime, transforming a looming catastrophe into a heartwarming family anecdote. "As you know," Thomas continued, his eyes darting between the centerpiece and the ceiling, anywhere but at me, "our distant cousin Martha and her husband passed away in a tragic accident some months ago. It was a terrible, terrible loss." He paused, allowing a moment of feigned solemnity. "They left behind an infant son. With no other family to speak of, the child was placed in the care of the state." He took a shaky sip of wine. "Well, Eleanor and I have been discussing it at length. We feel it is our duty, our privilege, to provide a home for this poor orphaned boy. We have filed the paperwork. We have been approved. We are adopting him." Eleanor's face lit up with a genuine, unclouded joy that was almost painful to watch. "Oh, Thomas, a baby, a little boy in this house again. How wonderful!" Richard nodded sagely. "A fine decision, son, a truly noble act. A Blackwood looks after his own. The boy will have a good life here, a proper upbringing." All eyes turned to me. I was expected to play my part. The dutiful daughter, the soon-to-be doting older sister. I felt the weight of their collective gaze, a physical pressure demanding my performance. I let the silence stretch for a moment, savoring the flicker of panic in my father's eyes. Then, I arranged my features into a soft, gentle smile. "A little brother," I said, my voice smooth and even. "That's a blessing. What will you name him?" The relief in the room was palpable. Thomas visibly relaxed, his shoulders slumping. Richard gave a small, approving nod. They believed I had accepted my role, that the final loose end had been tied. David, my father said, the name sounding foreign and heavy on his tongue. We'll name him David. David Blackwood, Richard added, his voice resonating with satisfaction. It has a good, strong ring to it. And so, David arrived. A small, perfect infant, swaddled in blue blankets, presented to the world as the happy outcome of a family tragedy. The town of Harmony Creek, as expected, murmured. Whispers followed me in the grocery store. Veiled questions were posed to our staff, but the Blackwood name, a monolith of wealth and influence, was a shield that deflected any real inquiry. The story was too neat, too charitable, to be seriously questioned. Thomas and Eleanor Blackwood, in their grief for a distant cousin, had opened their hearts and their home. Who would dare to tarnish such a noble narrative? My role was set, just as I had dictated in that cold, sterile room miles away. I was Amelia Blackwood, the quiet, doting older sister, the one who had returned from a difficult time at school, now ready to embrace her new family dynamic. I helped Eleanor with the feedings. I rocked the cradle when David fussed. I became the picture of gentle, selfless sisterhood, and with every maternal gesture I was forced to perform as a sister, my revenge began to unspool, not in a torrent of fire, but in a slow, seeping poison. It wasn't a revenge of loud confrontations or violent outbursts. It was the silent, exquisite torture of the everyday. It was watching my father, Thomas, the man who had sacrificed me to save himself, sit on the floor of the nursery, building a tower of blocks for the child born of his own daughter's rape. It was seeing the sweat on his brow as he read "Good Night, Moon," his voice cracking on the familiar, gentle words, the scene a grotesque parody of fatherhood. He was trapped. He had to perform the role of a loving father to the living evidence of his unforgivable sin, all under my watchful, placid gaze. Every hug David gave him was a brand, every dada a nail in the coffin of his soul. And then there was Richard. My grandfather, the shepherd who had savaged his own lamb. For him, the torture was of a different flavor. It was the agony of proximity without possession. He would watch David with a ravenous, proprietary hunger in his eyes. He couldn't claim him. The deal was sealed. This was Thomas's son. So he had to play the part of the proud great-grandfather. I would watch, a silent spectator from the doorway, as Richard bounced his own unacknowledged son on his knee. "Look at him," he would boom to anyone who would listen. A neighbor, a business associate. "Strong lad, got those Blackwood genes, you can see it already. A true heir." He was boasting about the strength of his own bloodline, unknowingly confirming his own crime to the world, yet no one could see it but me, him, and the broken man he called his son. He had to witness the child he created, his direct progeny, being raised as his great-grandson, hearing him call another man father. The ultimate humiliation for a man obsessed with lineage and control was having his legacy right in front of him, forever mislabeled, forever in the hands of the coward he despised. He had wanted to erase the problem. Instead, I had made it the permanent centerpiece of his life, a beautiful, innocent, walking, talking monument to his depravity. The cage he had built for me was gone. I was free, and I had just locked them all inside it with me. The years that followed were not measured by holidays or birthdays, but by the slow, inexorable growth of David. The seasons turned, marked by the changing size of the clothes folded in his drawers and the new scuff marks on the polished hardwood floors. Our mansion, once a symbol of Blackwood power, transformed. It ceased to be a home and became a psychological pressure cooker, the atmosphere thick with the steam of unspoken truths. The silence in that house was not empty. It was heavy, weighted with everything that could not be said. It was a living entity, feeding on our shared, poisoned air. David grew up in this strange, charged environment, blissfully unaware, a single point of light in a universe of shadows. He was a happy child, loved in the fractured, distorted ways we were capable of. He called me Amy, his big sister, his confidant, the one who would help him with his homework and listen to his stories about school. He would run to me with scraped knees and triumphant report cards, and I would play my part with a seamlessness that terrified my father. To David, I was a constant, steady presence, the calm anchor in his world. He called Thomas Dad and Eleanor Mom. Eleanor, drifting through the years in her medicated haze, was the perfect oblivious matriarch. She would bake his birthday cakes and kiss his forehead, her love for him pure and uncomplicated, a gentle, tragic irony in a house built on a foundation of tainted love. But the men knew. Oh, they knew. Every single day was a fresh torment, a new scene in the relentless play I had directed. I would watch Thomas at the dinner table, his face a mask of strained affection as David recounted his day. I saw the way he would flinch, an almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw every time David would reach out and hug him spontaneously. It was the touch of a ghost, the physical manifestation of his failure, and it made his skin crawl. He drank more. The single glass of sherry before dinner became 2, then 3, then a decanter of whiskey that sat permanently on the sideboard in his study, his closest companion. My weapon was my silence, my unwavering presence. I was the ghost at their feast, the living reminder in their gilded, perfect home. I would serve dinner, my movements calm and deliberate, and I would watch Richard's eyes. They were old now, webbed with fine lines, but they still held that sick, possessive pride. He would follow David's every move, a strange mix of grandfatherly affection and a predator's assessment of his own bloodline. He saw his own features emerging in the boy's face, and it was both his deepest satisfaction and his most profound torture. He had created this perfect specimen, this continuation of himself, but he could never claim him. He could only watch as Thomas, the son he considered weak and ineffectual, received the title of Dad. The whispered arguments between them grew more frequent, leaking from behind the closed door of the library. They fought over David's schooling, his friends, his future, each man trying to assert a control he felt was rightfully his. I never left. I never married. As the years passed, my role in the town of Harmony Creek solidified. I became the town spinster, the tragic Blackwood daughter. Such a shame, the ladies at the church bake sale would whisper, their eyes filled with a pity that amused me. So devoted to her family, she gave up her own life for that little brother of hers. Little did they know, the tragedy they pitied was a cage of my own meticulous design, a prison I had built not for myself, but for them. I embraced the persona. It was my armor and my camouflage. The quiet, unassuming spinster was invisible, and from that position of invisibility, I could watch everything. I was the warden of their secret, and my vigil was eternal. My life was not given up. It was repurposed. My purpose was to bear witness, to ensure that the debt owed to me was paid, not in a lump sum, but in daily, soul-crushing installments for the rest of their lives. The House of Blackwood was no longer a dynasty. It was a mausoleum for 2 living men, and I was its patient, silent keeper. The transition from boyhood to adolescence is a cruel alchemy, one that reshapes a face from the soft clay of childhood into the harder lines of the man to come. For David, this change was a verdict. As he entered his teenage years, the resemblance was no longer a subtle hint or a passing family likeness. It became undeniable, an accusation carved in flesh and bone. He had Richard's eyes, the same piercing, intelligent gray that could turn cold in an instant. He developed Richard's strong, stubborn jawline. Even his mannerisms began to echo the man he knew as his great-grandfather. The way he would steeple his fingers when deep in thought, a confident tilt of his head when making a point. It was as if Richard's very essence was being funneled into this young, oblivious vessel. This blossoming resemblance became a source of unbearable, corrosive tension. In town, it was a point of casual, innocent commentary. "My goodness, that boy is the spitting image of Richard in his youth," people would remark to Thomas, who would manage a tight, strangled smile in response. Each comment was another drop of acid on his already raw nerves. The pressure cooker inside the mansion hissed, its valve straining. Thomas's drinking escalated from a quiet habit to a sloppy, desperate escape. His conversations with his son became stilted and awkward, fraught with an anxiety David mistook for parental disapproval. He would try to connect, to talk about sports or girls, but Thomas would retreat, his gaze skittering away, his answers monosyllabic, before he'd excuse himself to freshen his drink. Richard, meanwhile, saw David's transformation as a triumph of his own powerful genetics, a final biological victory. As his own body began to fail him, his posture stooping and his steps becoming more deliberate, he tried to mold David with a feverish urgency. He wanted to make him a carbon copy of himself, a vessel for his ambitions and his worldview. He would corner David in the library for hours, lecturing him on business, politics, and the Blackwood legacy, filling the boy's head with his own cynical philosophies. This created bitter, explosive fights with Thomas. "You're suffocating him, old man," I overheard Thomas slur one evening, his voice a raw tear in the fabric of the house's silence. "Let him be a boy. Let him be his own person." Richard's reply was cold and dismissive. "You would have him be weak, like you. He has potential. He has my strength. I will not see it squandered by your sentimentality. He is a Blackwood, and he needs to understand what that means." "He is my son!" Thomas roared, a sound of pure anguish. The silence that followed was more damning than any response. I stood in the darkened hallway, a smile touching my lips in the gloom. My father, claiming ownership of the very thing that was destroying him. Richard, asserting his influence over the son he could never name. They were fighting over the boy, not out of love, but out of a desperate need to control the narrative of their own sin. The cracks in our family's facade finally splintered on Thanksgiving. The entire charade of our lives was condensed into that single day. The table was laden with food, the air filled with the scent of roasted turkey and the false warmth of forced festivity. Eleanor was serene in her usual haze. Thomas was already 3 glasses deep into the wine, his face flushed. Richard sat at the head of the table, a frail but still formidable king overseeing his fractured domain. And there was David, now a handsome, thoughtful 16-year-old, the picture of youthful innocence. The conversation was a minefield of safe topics: the weather, David's grades, town gossip. The tension was a 5th guest at the table, so thick and heavy you could taste it in the gravy. We were all performing our roles with grim determination. Then, in a lull in the conversation, David, ever the innocent, turned to me. His expression was open and genuinely curious. "Amy," he asked, his voice clear in the sudden quiet, "I was thinking the other day, why did you never leave? Go to college far away, find a husband, have your own family?" The question landed on the table like a stone, shattering the fragile surface of our peace. The clinking of silverware stopped. The air crackled. Every lie we had ever told, every secret we had buried, rushed into that sudden, terrible silence. I saw my father's eyes fixate on his wineglass as if it held the secrets to the universe. His knuckles were white where he gripped the stem. My grandfather cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound, and suddenly looked every one of his 80 years. Eleanor blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing her face, unsure why such a simple question had caused the world to stop turning. They were all looking at me, trapped. My answer would have to be another patch on the decaying tapestry of our lies. I held their gazes for a long, deliberate moment, letting them squirm in the quiet. I saw the fear in my father's eyes, the warning in my grandfather's. They were begging me, silently, to save them once again. I smiled faintly, a sad, enigmatic smile I had perfected over 16 years. I reached out and patted David's hand. "Some of us have duties here, David," I said, my voice soft, yet carrying the weight of an iron bell. "Some things are more important." The air didn't clear. It grew thicker, heavier, poisoned with the truth of my words. My duty was to them. My duty was this vengeance. My duty was to remain the keeper of their cage. David looked at me, confused but accepting. But Thomas and Richard understood. I had not just answered a question. I had renewed my vow. I had reminded them that the walls of their prison were as strong as ever, and I would never, ever let them go. The air in the room was thick with the scent of decay, not just of the body, but of a dynasty. It was a sweet, cloying smell, a mixture of expensive floral arrangements sent by people who feared the Blackwood name more than they loved the man, and the underlying chemical tang of medicine and antiseptic. Richard was 89 when his body, that ironclad vessel of his will, finally began to betray him. For decades, he had commanded rooms, fortunes, and lives with a mere flicker of his gaze. Now, he was a shrunken effigy of that power, lost in a sea of starched white linens and propped up by a mountain of pillows in the master suite of the mansion. He had ruled like a king. He had summoned us, me, a woman whose youth had been cremated in this very house. My father, Thomas, a ghost who had haunted these halls his entire life, and David, a man of 25 now, his face a sculpture of confused grief and duty. The light from the tall, arched window was a weak, autumnal gray, slicing across the room and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, silent witnesses. My father stood near the foot of the bed, his shoulders slumped in a posture of permanent defeat. He wrung his hands, a nervous habit he'd had since he was a boy, the skin around his knuckles white and strained. He couldn't look at his father, not directly. He never could. Instead, his eyes darted around the room, landing on the mahogany wardrobe, the silver water pitcher, the portrait of my mother, Eleanor, from a time before her mind had been clouded by prescribed oblivion. He looked anywhere but at the source of his lifelong terror and shame. David, by contrast, stood closer to the bed, his expression earnest and somber. He was the product of this house's darkest secret, yet he moved through it with an unburdened grace that was a constant, searing irony. To him, this was a simple, sad ritual, saying goodbye to his ailing great-grandfather, the venerable patriarch of Harmony Creek. He saw a frail old man, a titan at the end of his days. He did not see the monster. He could not see the architecture of lies that formed the very foundation of his existence. I remained still, a sentinel by the door, my presence a cold weight in the suffocating warmth of the room. I had waited for this moment for a lifetime, not with giddy anticipation, but with the patient, unyielding gravity of a celestial body slowly aligning for a final, cataclysmic eclipse. Every day of the past 25 years had been a rehearsal. Every shared meal, every holiday gathering, every hollow pleasantry had been a whetstone against which I sharpened this single perfect moment of reckoning. Richard's breathing was a shallow, ragged sound, a rusty hinge on a door about to close for good. His eyes, filmed over with age, but still possessing a spark of their old predatory intelligence, moved from Thomas's cowering form to David's handsome, concerned face. A faint rattling sound emerged from his chest, which resolved itself into a weak, raspy voice. "David," he wheezed, the word clinging to the air like smoke. He beckoned with a single, trembling finger. David moved closer, leaning in with the deference Richard had always commanded. "You," he rasped, his voice gaining a thread of its former strength, fueled by the last embers of his colossal ego. "You are the legacy, the future of the Blackwood name." He said it with such finality, such possessive pride. He was anointing his successor. He was passing the torch, ensuring his bloodline, his influence, would march on. He was looking at the physical proof of his virility, the handsome young man who bore his unmistakable features, the strong jaw, the piercing blue eyes, the shape of his hands. To the town, to David himself, it was the miracle of genetics, a dominant strain passed down through generations. To Richard, it was the ultimate proof of his enduring power. He then turned his gaze to me. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Across the room, our eyes met. In his, I saw no remorse, no regret. There was only a flicker of that old, cruel power, a final, triumphant glint that said, clear as any word he could have spoken, "I won. I took everything from you, and in the end, I still won. My legacy is secure." He thought he had won. He believed that my silence over the decades was the silence of a broken thing, the quiet surrender of the lamb he'd led to slaughter so many years ago in the dusty silence of the library. He thought my life, lived as the town's resident spinster, the quiet, unmarried aunt, was the final monument to his victory. He was wrong. His victory was the illusion I had so carefully constructed for him. My silence was not a void. It was a crucible. That's when I moved. The spell of my stillness broke. I crossed the room in a few measured, silent steps. The plush Persian rug muffled my footfalls. Thomas flinched as I passed him, as if my very proximity might sear him. David looked up, his brow furrowed in mild confusion at my sudden approach. I paid them no mind. My entire universe had contracted to the space between my lips and Richard Blackwood's ear. I leaned down, my hair brushing against the rough linen of his pillowcase. I could smell the stale breath, the final exhalation of his life. I spoke in a whisper, a low, clear tone pitched so only he and my father, standing a few feet away, could hear. It was not the voice of a hysterical girl, but the calm, precise articulation of a judge delivering a sentence. "You think he's your legacy?" I began, my voice a silken thread of poison. "A great-grandson? A continuation of the noble Blackwood line?" I felt a faint tremor run through his frail body. He was trying to pull his head away, but he was too weak. My father's breath hitched, a tiny, strangled gasp. "You're wrong," I continued, letting each word land with surgical precision. "He is not your great-grandson. He's your son." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked all the air, all the sound, all the history from the room. I could feel the incomprehension radiating from Richard, a frantic cognitive scrambling as his dying mind tried to process the impossible. He had always assumed, with the supreme arrogance of a man who never considers the perspectives of his victims, that we had simply adopted a random child to cover up the scandal of my pregnancy. He believed the lie he helped create because it was convenient, because it fit his narrative of control. The idea that this boy, his boy, the living symbol of his legacy, was raised under his very nose as another man's son, as the son of his own weak, pathetic child, was a twist so perverse, a humiliation so profound, he had never conceived of it. I leaned in closer, my lips almost touching his ear. "And your final humiliation," I whispered, delivering the killing blow, "is that you had to watch another man raise him. Your own pathetic son. Every single time David looked at Thomas and called him Dad, you lost. Every time he ran to Thomas for comfort, you lost. Every time you heard people praise the Blackwood genes in him, thinking they were talking about a legacy passed through your son, they were talking about the son you were never allowed to claim. I made sure you lived long enough to see it. I made sure you saw him grow into a man, loving the very person you despise for his weakness. That is your true legacy, Richard. Not a name on a building, but a lifetime of being a ghost at your own son's table." Richard's eyes flew open. They were wide, no longer filmed with the cataracts of age, but blazing with pure, unadulterated horror. It was not anger. It was not defiance. It was the terror of a god discovering he is mortal, and worse, a fool. The carefully constructed fortress of his life, his pride, his name, had been razed to the ground in a single whispered paragraph. The truth, the one I had carried like a stone in my gut for a quarter of a century, had finally found its target. He tried to scream. He tried to deny it, to curse me, to summon one last surge of his tyrannical will. But his body had already received its final command from his shattered mind. All that came out was a wet, guttural gurgle. A dark flush spread up his neck and across his face. His limbs twitched, a grotesque, spastic dance. His eyes, fixed on my face, were portals to a mind being annihilated from within. He had a catastrophic stroke right there in front of us. His last moment on this earth was not one of peace, not one of a patriarch surrounded by his loving family. It was one of absolute psychological terror, a perfectly executed demolition, delivered by the lamb he thought he'd slaughtered. The heart monitor beside the bed, which had been beeping in a slow, steady rhythm, erupted into a frantic, high-pitched alarm before flatlining into a single, piercing tone. In the deafening silence that followed my grandfather's final breath, the single, continuous note from the heart monitor was the only sound. It was the sound of an ending, a long, overdue, ugly ending. A nurse rushed in, followed by a doctor, their movements practiced and efficient, but it was a pointless pantomime. The king was dead. The monster was gone. The room was suddenly just a room, and Richard Blackwood was just a body cooling under a sheet. And then, a new sound began. It started as a low whimper, a choked animal noise from the foot of the bed. My father, Thomas, shattered. The 50-year-old dam of denial, guilt, and terror that he had so painstakingly constructed around his heart finally burst. The careful facade of the dutiful son, the respectable town figure, the long-suffering husband, crumbled into dust. He fell to his knees on the Persian rug, his body folding in on itself as if his spine had dissolved. He was not just crying, he was weeping with the force of a lifetime of unshed tears. Great, heaving sobs racked his body, raw and agonizing. It was the sound of a soul breaking open. David, who had been standing frozen, his face a mask of shock and confusion from the moment I began to whisper, rushed to our father's side. "Dad? Dad, what is it? What did she say to him?" he asked, his voice laced with bewildered concern. He placed a hand on Thomas's shaking shoulder, trying to offer comfort for a wound he could not comprehend. That touch was the final catalyst. Thomas looked up, his face a mess of tears and slobber, his eyes wild with a pain that went beyond grief. He looked at David, his beloved son, the boy he had raised, the one good thing in his wretched life. And in that look, David saw something that terrified him more than the death of his great-grandfather. He saw the abyss. Thomas choked out, the words ripped from his throat. He couldn't finish. He just shook his head, his hands clawing at his own face, as if to tear off the mask he'd worn for so long. He turned his gaze from David to me, and in his eyes I saw it all. The accusation, the terror, the plea, and finally, a sliver of grotesque relief. The burden had become too heavy to carry. "Tell him," he rasped at me. "You started this. You finish it." But I remained silent. This was not my confession to make. My part in the reckoning was done. Richard's judgment was delivered. This next part, this painful, messy, devastating truth, belonged to my father. It was his penance. He had been a silent accomplice for decades. Now he would be a screaming witness. David looked back and forth between us, the atmosphere in the room crackling with a new and terrible energy. "Finish what? What is going on? Someone, please tell me what's happening." His voice was rising, bordering on panic. Thomas took a deep, shuddering breath and pulled his gaze back to David. He looked at the boy, the man he had raised as his own, the son who was not his son, the living, breathing evidence of his own cowardice. "The whole thing," Thomas began, his voice a broken whisper that seemed to be scraped raw from the very bottom of his soul. "My whole life, your whole life, it's all been a lie." And then he confessed. It wasn't a neat chronological narrative. It was a torrent, a flood of poison that had been building for 50 years. The words tumbled out of him, disjointed and frantic, a chaotic mosaic of horror. He confessed his own weakness, his terror of his father, the towering, monstrous figure who had controlled his every move since birth. He confessed to knowing, or at least suspecting, what Richard was doing to me in the library, behind closed doors, under the guise of special lessons. He confessed to seeing the light go out in my eyes, to noticing my flinches and my nightmares, and to deliberately looking away, choosing his own safety, his own comfort, over his daughter's soul. He confessed the day I came to him, a terrified 14-year-old girl, and told him what his father was doing. He spoke the words aloud for the first time, the ones he had hurled at me then. A vicious lie. He confessed to calling me a liar to my face, to threatening me, all to protect the pristine Blackwood name and his own precarious place within it. The shame contorted his features as he spoke, making him look ancient and grotesque. Then came the second part of the confession, the part about David. He told him about my pregnancy, about the secret meeting with Richard and the family doctor, where I was treated not as a victim, but as a problem to be disposed of. He confessed to his own panic, his fear of the scandal, and his pathetic, whispered admission that it was too late to do anything. David's face had gone from confusion to disbelief, and now to a creeping, sickening horror. His world was not just collapsing, it was being systematically unmade, brick by painful brick. And then, Thomas sobbed, his voice cracking entirely. She made a deal. She said she'd go away, have the baby, but on one condition. The baby would come back here, to Harmony Creek, and I would have to raise it, as my son. David stared at Thomas, his mouth slightly agape. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture so monstrous he could barely look at it. He slowly, mechanically, turned his head to look at me. His sister. His quiet, somber, perpetually single sister, who had always looked at him with an intensity he could never quite decipher. His mother. I held his gaze. I did not flinch. I did not offer a comforting lie or a soft apology. I gave him the truth, cold and hard and absolute in my eyes. He looked at me, the architect of his entire life's lie. He saw the woman who had orchestrated this elaborate, decades-long psychological torture of our father and grandfather. He saw the puppeteer who had pulled his strings from the day he was born. And in his eyes, I saw the cataclysm. I saw the tectonic plates of his reality grinding against each other, shattering everything he had ever known to be true. His father was not his father. His great-grandfather, the man who had just died, was his biological father, and his mother's rapist. The weight of it was enough to crush a person, and I could see it pressing down on him, stealing the air from his lungs. But what came next was not what I had expected. There was no anger in his eyes. There was no rage, no accusation. There was only a deep, profound, bottomless ocean of pain and horrified understanding. He didn't rage at me. How could he? In that moment of terrible clarity, he saw it all. He saw the trapped 14-year-old girl, betrayed by her father and brutalized by her grandfather. He saw that this twisted, cold, lifelong revenge was the only power she had ever been allowed to wield. It was the desperate, brilliant, monstrous act of a powerless victim refusing to be erased. He looked from my face to the weeping, broken man on the floor, the man he had called Dad, and then to the sheet-covered form on the bed. He finally understood. We were not a family. We were a collection of casualties orbiting the gravitational pull of a monster. He and I were the two biggest victims of the men who had just died, one in body, the other in spirit. His gaze returned to me, and in the awful, silent space between us, a new and terrible connection was forged, a bond of shared trauma, a silent acknowledgement that our lives had both been stolen in the same fire. And so here I am, an old woman in a decaying mansion, filled with the ghosts of sins I both suffered and orchestrated. The echoes of that confession in the death room never truly faded. They soaked into the wallpaper, settled in the dust, and became the permanent atmosphere of this house. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of ruin. Thomas drank himself to death a decade ago. After the confession, he was an untethered thing, a man without a purpose or a facade. The guilt he had kept at bay for so long consumed him entirely. He didn't fight it. He welcomed it, pouring it down his throat bottle by bottle until his liver failed and his heart gave out. He died in the same house where he'd lived his life as a prisoner, and I was the one who found him. There was no satisfaction in it, only a quiet, grim sense of an equation finally being balanced. One monster dead from shock, one coward dead from shame. David moved away almost immediately. He went to the coast, to Portland, as far from the suffocating history of Harmony Creek as he could get. He changed his last name, shedding the Blackwood identity like a contaminated skin. He needed an ocean, he'd said in the one and only letter he ever wrote me. He needed something vast and clean enough to wash away the filth of his origin. We don't speak. We can't. What would we even say? The truth between us is too immense, too terrible for words. But once a year, on my birthday, I receive a simple, unsigned card. It's always the same, no greeting, no signature, just a small, simple drawing of the ocean with waves crashing on a shore. It isn't a gesture of forgiveness, nor one of affection. It is his way of saying he knows. It's an acknowledgement of our shared wreckage, a quiet signal from his lighthouse to mine across a vast distance. It is the only connection we have left, a fragile thread woven from a lifetime of pain. I live alone now, the last Blackwood in a house that bears our name like a curse. I walk these empty halls, where the floorboards creak like old bones, and I feel the weight of every moment. I see the ghost of a little girl hiding in the library. I see the ghost of a broken man weeping on the floor. I see the ghost of a triumphant monster taking his last horrified breath. My revenge was not a fiery, explosive act. It was a slow-growing tree planted in poisoned soil, which took a lifetime to bear its bitter fruit. I never asked for forgiveness. I only sought a balance. My father once looked me in the eyes, his own filled with a coward's panic, and told me it was too late to do anything. He was wrong. It is never too late to plant a seed of truth in a garden of lies. You just have to have the patience, the cold, unbending resolve, to wait a lifetime to watch what grows.